verbs or verbi. So verbs are probably the most frustrating yet helpful element of Italian grammar. Okay, so if you're already familiar with Italian, you're probably familiar with conjugating and all the different irregular verbs out there. So we're just gonna walk through bit by bit here and just get you familiar with verbs. Okay, they can be a bit overwhelming, but just take it one step at a time, and we'll try not to get too overwhelmed by it. Okay. So we are on to verbi. We're on the second rung already. Okay. So verbs. What is a verb? A verb, or un verbo, is basically the action part of a sentence. Okay, so for example, I run home. Okay, the verb would be run. You have a book. The verb would be have. And he is a boy. The verb would be is. How many types of verbs are there in Italian? So there are three main types of verbs. These are based on their endings in the infinitive form. So we have ARE verbs, ERE verbs, and IRE verbs. For example, an ARE verb would be andare, to go. Andare. You could see the ARE here ending. An ERE would be essere, to be. Essere, ERE. And IRE, dormire, to sleep. Dormire. And there's the IRE there on the ending. Okay, just to note, verbs can be either regular, meaning they all follow the same conjugation pattern, or irregular. Infinitives. What is an infinitive? So the infinitive, l'infinito, is the basic form of a verb before it's been conjugated or modified to match the subject and verb tense. In English, it's the to form of a verb. In Italian, it's the ARE, ERE, and IRE form. For example, parlare, to speak. Okay, you see how the ARE, it's got the ARE ending, and in English, it's to speak. Avere is to have, and finire, to finish. When you use the infinitive form, you use the infinitive form when you want to say to do something. Okay, so to do something. For example, I want to play. Voglio giocare. So I want, voglio, to play. Giocare. So in this case, you leave on the ARE ending and you don't conjugate it. In this example, voglio, has been conjugated from the irregular verb volere, and giocare remains in its infinitive form. So I don't have to conjugate every verb then? Nope. In general, you conjugate the first verb in a series, then leave the immediately following verbs in their infinitive form, which is way easier. Okay, so again, back to this example. Voglio giocare, you conjugate the first verb, volere, and you don't conjugate giocare if you want to leave it with the to form, in the to form. How to conjugate verbs. So what does it mean to conjugate a verb? Conjugating, or coniugare, a verb means to take the infinitive form and change it to match the subject doing the action and the verb tense being used. Do we conjugate in English? That's a good question. Yes, we do, but not nearly to the same extent as in the Romance languages, such as in Italian, Spanish, and French. So for example, to speak in the present tense in English, you really only change the third person singular here. So I speak, you speak, he or she speaks, we speak, they speak. Okay, so we don't conjugate as much as we do in the Romance languages, because in Italian, Okay, for the same word, you would use parlare in the present tense. Okay, io parlo, tu parli, lui, lei parla, noi parliamo, and loro parlano. Okay, so you see how the ending is different on every single one of these verbs? That's what we mean by conjugating. And this is just the present tense, for example. Do all verbs follow the same pattern for each tense? Regular verbs follow the same pattern. All the endings are the same. But irregular verbs need to be memorized, although many do follow the similar patterns. Verbs in a series. How do I use two or more verbs in a row? Well, for example, if you want to say, I want to play, in English, you'd say, I want, and then you add to play. Voglio giocare. So, voglio giocare, you add the two verbs together, but like we just talked about, voglio is conjugated and giocare remains in the infinitive form. So in this case, we have conjugated and infinitive. So voglio, I want, the first verb is conjugated from volere to the io form, and giocare, to play, is left as an infinitive. So if you want to have more than two verbs in a row, in this example, I want to learn to speak Italian. Voglio imparare a parlare italiano. So just to note, some infinitives like imparare always take the preposition a, di, or da, but don't worry about that right now. Okay, that's why we just added it on here, imparare a. So in this example, we have I want plus to learn plus to speak Italian. Voglio is conjugated. Imparare a is to learn. Parlare, to speak Italiano. Conjugated, infinitive, infinitive. Pretty simple, right? It makes it a little bit easier when you use more than one verb in a row in this case, because you don't have to worry about conjugating the following verbs. Okay, so it's easy to say things like that, to make a sentence longer by adding to do something, to do that, to do this, and just leave it in the infinitive form. Verb tenses. What is a verb tense? So verb tenses are the conjugated forms of a verb. They determine the time in which an action takes place. For example, in the present tense, I walk to the store. In the future tense, I will walk to the store. And in the past tense, I walked to the store. How many verb tenses are there? There are basically 8 simple tenses and 8 compound tenses in Italian, but you really only need about 5 to get started. Okay, so it may feel overwhelming that there's so many, but just stick to the basics for now, and you can always add more tenses as you progress. So what's the difference between a simple and a compound tense? Simple tenses only require one verb. For example, I go home, vado a casa. A compound tense requires 2 verbs, usually an auxiliary verb, meaning avere or essere, plus a participle or un participio. So, for example, I did come home late. Sono venuto a casa tardi. I have eaten already. Ho mangiato di già. Okay, so as you can see in both of these instances, we added the verb essere, we conjugated to sono for the first person singular, so I. Sono venuto. So in this case, venuto is a past participle of venire, which is to come. So as you can see, we put two verbs together. Or I have eaten already. So o avere. O is a conjugated form of avere in the first person singular. And then mangiato would be the past participle of mangiare. So as you can see, it's a compound because you're putting two verbs together. Okay, so we have the 16 basic verb tenses. What are the 8 simple verb tenses? So the simple verb tenses are as follows. We have the present, il presente del indicativo, the simple future, il futuro semplice, the imperfect, l'imperfetto del indicativo, the conditional, il condizionale, the imperative or commands, l'imperativo, the subjunctive, il presente del congiuntivo, the imperfect subjunctive, l'imperfetto del congiuntivo, and finally the past remote or il passato remoto. What are the 8 compound tenses? Okay, so the compound tenses are as follows. We have the progressive forms, which are multiple tenses formed with stare and a gerund. Those are the words that end in ing in English. The simple past, il passato prossimo, which is called simple, but it's actually compound, so go figure. The conditional perfect, il condizionale passato. The future perfect, il futuro anteriore. The pluperfect indicative, il trapassato prossimo. The past subjunctive, il congiuntivo passato. The pluperfect subjunctive, il trapassato congiuntivo. And finally, the pluperfect, or the il trapassato remoto. Okay, so obviously you don't have to learn all of those at the beginning. In fact, you probably don't ever have to learn all of those unless you're going into interpreting or into a professional field. But at the beginning, I would recommend, in what order would you recommend learning these verb tenses? So here's what I think. I think that you should start with the first few. Okay, so in this order is my recommendation, starting with the present and then go to the simple past, which is a compound tense, and then the simple future, the imperfect, and then the conditional. And then if you want to throw in the imperative and commands, I think those are pretty much going to get you to, it's going to get you through most of what you want to express, at least at the beginning. Okay, so do I really need to learn all these right now? No, you certainly don't. But I wanted to give you the big picture. Okay, start with the first 3, then add the next 2 or 3, and then progress down the list depending on your goals. Okay, so when I was tutoring a young man, and we'd already gone through about 7 different tenses, verb tenses, and he finally said, how many tenses are there? So I realized that he didn't have the big picture, and I wanted to give you that big picture so that you know how far you are in terms of how many verb tenses you've already learned, and so that you don't feel like it's never ending. Okay, there is a finite amount of verb tenses, so just take it one at a time and start with the present. Then I would say the simple past, simple future, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, regular verbs in the present tense. When do you use the present tense? The present tense is used to describe something occurring now or in the near future. So for example, mangiare in the present tense can mean I eat. So io mangio can mean I eat, I do eat, I am eating, or I will eat soon. So it's kind of, in this sense, it's much easier than English because you see how there's 4 different ways of saying the exact same thing in English. as one phrase in Italian. So this replaces all 4 of these. How do you conjugate the present tense? Okay, so we have, as we talked about in the subject pronoun section, we have first person, second person, and third person, singular and plural. Okay, so for an ARE verb, so we have ARE, ERE, and IRE verbs. And then for the IRE, we have 2, or some may say 3 different conjugations for the IRE verbs. So the basic endings in the present tense for a regular verb, regular ARE verb would be o, I, a, iamo, ate, ano. Okay, you can, as I always did, just make a little song out of it. So o, I, a, iamo, ate, ano. For example, parlare, to speak. So io parlo, tu parli, lei or lui parla, noi parliamo, voi parlate, and loro parlano. Now, if you have an ARE verb that is preceded by a C, okay, you need to add an H in here and here to retain the hard C sound. Okay, otherwise this will change to a soft C. So for instance, it turns into cercare is to look for or to search for. So we have cerco, cerchi, cerca, cerchiamo, cercate, cercano. Now, if we don't have the H in here, instead of being cerchi, this would be cerci. And instead of cerchiamo, it would be cerciamo. So that is why we have to put the H in here to retain the hard C sound that you have with a C-ARE verb. Okay, likewise, pagare, to pay. So the same thing with the G, you need to add the H in there to retain the hard G sound that you get from a G-ARE verb. So pago, paghi, paga, paghiamo, pagate, pagano. Okay, so again, we added the H in here in the second person singular and the first person plural. Okay, an ERE verb, the endings would be o, I, e, iamo, ette, ono. Okay, so do you see any difference here? The difference is in the third person. The third person singular, the second person plural, and the third person plural. Okay, so those are the only ones that are different. The o, I, and iamo stay the same, no matter if it's an ARE or ERE verb. So for example, we have vedere, which is to see. Vedo, vedi, vede, vediamo, vedete, vedono. In an IRE verb, now where do you see the differences? That's right. The only difference is in the ite. Ette, ite. Okay? Everything else is the same between the ERE and the IRE verbs. So that means that for all 3 of these, the o, I, and iamo are the same. So the only difference is these guys here. And between these 2, the only difference is this one. Okay? So we have dormire is our regular IRE verb. Dormo, dormi, dorme, dormiamo, dormite, dormono. And now we also have a second conjugation of the IRE verbs, which instead of ending in these regular endings here, we change them to isco, ishi, isce, iamo, ite, iscono. Okay, so they probably sound kind of different to you, but these 2 remain the same. Okay, so the iamo and ite are the same here between the both different conjugations of the IRE verbs. Okay, but then we got the isco, ishi, isce, and then the iscono are different. For our example, we have capire, which is to understand or to know. So we have capisco, capisci, capisce, capiamo, capite, capiscono. Okay, so notice that the sound is soft here, capisci, capisce, and it's hard, capisco and capiscono here and here. Just something to be aware of. Okay, irregular verbs in the present tense. Do all verbs follow the same pattern? No, there are many irregular verbs, verbi irregolari, that you'll just have to memorize. So below are just a few of the most common ones. Essere, to be. Avere, to have. Fare, to do or to make. Volere, to want. Dare, to give. Stare, to be. Bere, to drink. Andare, to go. Dovere, to have to or must. And potere, to be able to or can. How do you conjugate these in the present tense? Okay, so just like we had in the previous one, in the previous slide, we have, okay, essere. So again, you're just going to have to memorize these. So I'm just going to go over them all once, and then you'll have to study this on your own, and just try and just keep going over them over and over and over and over and over again until you remember them. And the more you use it, the more you will get used to what they sound like and what they should be. And just practice makes perfect, I guess. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so we have sono, sei, e, siamo, siete, sono. Okay, sono, sei, e, siamo, siete, sono. Avere, o, hai, a, abbiamo, avete, hanno. Okay, notice that the H is silent, but we retain it so that you know that it's the conjugated form of avere. O, hai, a, abbiamo, avete, hanno. Fare. Faccio, fai, fa, facciamo, fate, fanno. Volere. Voglio, vuoi, vuole, vogliamo, volete, vogliono. Okay, remember we got that GLI sound in there? Okay, so it's not voglio, it's voglio. Okay, voglio, vuoi, vuole, vogliamo, volete, vogliono. Dare, to give. Okay, do, dai, da, diamo, date, danno. Notice there's an accent on da. That's to distinguish between this and from. Okay, so da also means from without the accent mark. So with the accent, it means third person singular of dare. So do, dai, da, diamo, date, danno. Stare. Sto, stai, sta, stiamo, state, stanno. Bere. Bevo, bevi, beve. Beviamo, bevete, bevono. Okay, this is very different, very, very irregular. Okay. Andare. Vado, vai, va. Andiamo, andate, vanno. Okay. Dovere. Devo, devi, deve. Dobbiamo, dovete, devono. Okay, this one is very similar to bere, just because you got the same endings here. Devo, devi, deve. Okay, bevo, bevi, beve. This one's a little bit different. Dobbiamo from beviamo. But then these are the same. So dovete, bevete. Devono, bevono. Okay, and then finally we have potere. So posso, puoi, può. possiamo, potete, possono. Again, we have an accent mark here on the po. Yeah, and these are pretty different as well. So I just have to memorize those. Okay, great job. And just go over these as many times as you can and make a little song out of it so that you can remember it in your head and you'll get it eventually. Okay, reflexive verbs. What are reflexive verbs? Reflexive verbs, or I verbi riflessivi, are verbs whose subject and object are the same. Therefore, the action is reflected back to the person or thing performing the action. How are reflexive verbs used? They are generally used when referring to actions that you perform on yourself, like dressing yourself, or reciprocal actions, like hugging each other, and they're always accompanied by a reflexive pronoun. Okay, so what are reflexive pronouns? A reflexive pronoun, or un pronome riflessivo, is a pronoun that is used with reflexive verbs to show that the action is directed back at the subject. In English, the reflexive pronoun is often implied rather than stated, such as in I get dressed rather than saying I dress myself, or we hug rather than saying we hug each other. But it's usually expressed in Italian. Okay, so that's a little bit different between English and Italian. They are as follows. Okay, so we have our singular and plural pronouns. So in the first person singular, we have me to mean myself, and we have ci to mean ourselves. Okay, and in second person, we have ti to mean yourself, and vi to mean yourselves in the plural. And finally, in the third person, we have si to mean himself, herself, or yourself. And if you'll notice, it's also si in the plural, okay, to mean themselves. So reflexive pronouns follow the same placement patterns as direct object pronouns, which we'll cover later in the course. Okay, so I just want to get you a little bit familiar with it in this module here in the verbs area, so that once we start talking about how to use direct object pronouns, then you'll know a little bit more about how to use these as well. But these are the ones that you use with reflexive verbs. Okay. So, for example, if you say, I call myself, in Italian, you say, I call myself, but you really are saying, my name is in English. Okay, so you'd say, mi chiamo, and then your name. Okay, so I would say, mi chiamo Laura, or I call myself Laura. Okay, you wash yourself, and then you dress yourself, would be ti lavi, poi ti vesti. Okay, so in this case, we're using the reflexive verb lavarsi and the reflexive verb vestirsi. Okay, so in this case, we put ti before the conjugated verb. Okay, so ti lavi. Okay, these are both the second person singular. And then I also have the verb vestirsi. So we have poi, then ti vesti. Okay, so again, it goes before the conjugated verb in the second person singular in this case. Okay, and you can tell that these are reflexive verbs because they end in si, okay, or si. Okay, and then we have she wakes herself up at 8 o'clock, or in Italian, lei si sveglia alle 8. Okay, so in this case, we're using the reflexive verb svegliarsi. Again, you can tell it's a reflexive verb because it ends in si. Okay, and here we put the si, okay, because it's third person singular, saying she, before the conjugated verb. Okay, so lei si sveglia alle 8. Okay, and then finally, we hug each other tightly. Ci abbracciamo forte. Okay, so in this case, we're using the first person plural. Okay, ci. And then we have our Abbracciamo, okay, which comes after the ci because it's conjugated. Forte. Okay, so there's a quick introduction to reflexive verbs. If they're still a little bit confusing, don't worry. I just wanted to introduce them to you, and they'll get easier to use as you practice. The impersonal C. What is the impersonal C? So the impersonal C is simply a way to express an action, a way of thinking, or behaving that is generalized, recommended, or suggested. Okay, now you're probably wondering what that means. So I'm just going to explain it a little bit here. So how and when is it used? It is often used when giving directions or in a cooking recipe to mean one or oneself. It is used with the third person singular or plural conjugation of the verb in accordance with the direct object. Okay, so can it be used with reflexive verbs? Good question. Yes. However, in order to avoid a double CC, you need to change the first C to a chi. For example, if you want to say one gets up early when one has children, you would, rather than saying si sveglia, you would say ci si sveglia presto quando si hanno bambini. Okay, so we just don't want to have that double CC because it sounds kind of silly, but so we have to change the first one to a chi. Okay, now let's give you some examples here. So how does one say any word that you're wondering how to say in Italian? Okay, so how does one say ciao or hello in Italian? Come si dice hello in Italian, for example? Okay, so come si dice is how does one say? So this is one good example of how to use the impersonal si because we're saying how does one say? And then whatever word it is that you want to know how to say in Italian. How would one get to the train station from here? Come si va alla stazione di treno da qui? Okay, so again, we have the si, va. Okay, so this is the third person singular, va, and then we're just using the impersonal si, just placed directly before the conjugated verb. One can't enter the building without permission. Non si può entrare nell'edificio senza permesso. Okay, so in this case, we're saying one cannot enter, okay, in the building. So we're using, again, the third person singular, and we put it right before the conjugated verb. Okay, so in this case, we do have two verbs together. So if you recall, we don't conjugate the second verb because we're saying one can't enter the building. Okay, so non si può entrare. One eats lots of spaghetti when in Italy. Okay, so si mangiano tanti spaghetti quando si è in Italia. Okay, so this example, I have two different forms of the verb here. So in this first instance, okay, we're using si mangiano. And if you notice, this is the third person plural conjugation of mangiare. Okay, and you're wondering, why are you using the plural form? Well, it's because if you look back up here, it says in accordance with the direct object. So in this case, the direct object is spaghetti, okay, tanti spaghetti, which is plural. So you have to use a plural verb here, okay? So si mangiano tanti spaghetti. But then here we use the singular again, okay? Just like all these other examples. We're using the third person singular, okay? So si è when one is in Italia, okay? Because it's singular here. Okay, I know it's probably a little bit confusing, but once again, it just takes some practice and some getting used to. And again, if you have any questions, just post them in the community chat. Okay, and we have one more example. So where can one find the bathroom? Dove si trova il bagno? A very important question when traveling. Okay, so again, we have singular. It's a singular verb here. Dove si trova il bagno? Okay, because il bagno is the direct object and it is singular. Okay, so dove si trova il bagno? Okay, there you have it. Hopefully it's a little bit clearer than before. But again, if it's not super clear, don't worry about it, okay? How to use verbs in a sentence. Okay, so we have, let's see here, our very, very simple sentences here. So I am, you are, he is, she is, you, formal are, we are, you all are, and they are. Okay, so as we looked at before, the subject goes first, okay, in English, and then the verb comes after. Okay, and we're using the verb to be in this case. So in Italian, we have the same thing, il soggetto and il verbo. We're using essere. So io sono, okay, I am, io sono. Tu sei, lui è, lei è, lei è. Okay, remember this is the you formal. Noi siamo, voi siete, and loro sono. Okay, so as you can see, these are pretty much exactly the same. The only difference would be that in Italian, you don't need the subject pronouns unless you need it for clarification or emphasis. Whereas in English, we need them. You always pretty much need them. Okay, and then we have another example here. So we have the verb to have. Okay, I have, you have, he has, she has, you have, we have, you have, and they have. Okay, so the only one that's different here is right here, he and she has. Okay, and then in Italian, okay, we have io ho, tu hai, lui ha, lei ha, lei ha, noi abbiamo, voi avete, and loro hanno. Okay, so once again, we have our subject pronoun here and then our verb after. Okay, so simple, very, very simple way to use a verb in a sentence. Okay, so now we have our first 50 verbs to learn. Okay, so I'm going to say each verb twice, and I want you to repeat after me each time. Okay, so I'll leave a little, I'll say the verb, and then I'll leave a little pause, and then I'll say it again and leave a pause. Okay, and then say the English. So just follow along with me and practice your pronunciation. Okay. Oh, and then I just want to tell you here that if the verbs are starred, okay, it means it's an irregular verb. And also, these may be regular in the present tense, okay, but I still put a little star by it in case it's irregular in, say, the past participle, which is the case for a lot of these, or in maybe another tense, okay, but just because if you look it up, it'll it'll probably say that it's an irregular verb, okay? But again, it may still be regular in the present tense. So you just have to look them up and see how they're conjugated, okay, if it's marked as irregular. Okay, and then a double star means that it follows a slightly different spelling pattern than all the regular verbs. And then this just means it's the second conjugation of an IRE verb. Okay, so that's like with conosco, conosci, conosce, things like that. Okay, the isco, ishi, ishe forms. All right, let's get started. Okay, accendere, accendere, to turn on the lights. Amare, amare, to love. andare, andare, to go. Aprire, aprire, to open. Avere, avere, to have. Bere, bere, to drink. Camminare, camminare, to walk. Capire, capire, to understand. Chiamare, chiamare, to call. Comprare, comprare, to buy. Conoscere, conoscere, means to know, meaning to be familiar with, as opposed to sapere, which means to know, like the information. Okay. Cucinare, cucinare, to cook. Dare, dare, to give. Dire, dire, to say or to tell. Dormire, dormire, to sleep. Dovere, dovere, to have to or to must do something. Entrare, entrare, to enter. Essere, essere, to be. Fare, fare, to do or to make. Finire, finire, okay, to finish, okay. Girare, girare, to turn. Guardare, guardare, to look at or watch. Lavare, lavare, to wash. Lavorare, lavorare, to work. Okay, notice these are very similar, okay, but they are very different. Leggere, leggere, to read. Okay, and then we have mangiare. Mangiare, to eat. It's an important one. Mettersi, mettersi, to put on oneself or to wear. It's a reflexive verb. Parlare, parlare, to speak or talk. Partire, partire, to leave. Pensare, pensare, to think. Piacere, piacere, to be pleasing to someone, usually. Potere, potere, to be able to or can. Prendere, prendere, to take or get. Pulire, pulire, to clean. Rispondere, rispondere, to respond or reply. Salire, salire, to climb up. Sapere, sapere, to know. Scrivere, scrivere, to write. Sentire, sentire, to hear or to feel. Sorridere, sorridere, to smile. Stare, stare, to be or to stay. Studiare, studiare, okay, to study. Succedere, succedere, to happen or occur. Tenere, tenere, to hold. Tornare, tornare, to return or go back. Uscire, uscire, to exit. Vedere, vedere is to see. Venire, venire, to come. Vivere, vivere is to live. And volere, volere is to want. Okay, and there you have it, your first 50 verbs to learn. Okay, so just be sure to go over this a few times and become familiar with these verbs, and it'll help you get started on being able to use a lot of these in conversation. Okay, so these a lot of these are pretty helpful common verbs. Okay, we're on to quiz module 2.2 verbs. There are only 5 questions, so I will go ahead and read each question aloud and the possible answers, and I'll pause for a few moments to give you a chance to try and figure out the right answer before I give you the correct answer. If you need more time, just go ahead and pause the video. All right, let's get started. Number 1. Which of the following are the basic verb endings in Italian? Choose all answers that apply. A. Ere. B. Ere. C. Ire. D. Ore. Or E. Ure. Okay, so letters A, B, and C are the correct answer. There are 3 main types of verbs. These are based on their endings in the infinitive form, ere, ere, and ire. Number 2, which of the following verbs have already been conjugated? Choose all answers that apply. A. Parlare. B. Vedere. C. Dormo. D. Mangiare. Or E. Cerchiamo. Okay, so the correct answers were C and E. If the verb ends in ere, ere, or ire, then it's in its infinitive form. Otherwise, it has already been conjugated to correspond to who or what is performing the action. In this case, dormo and cerchiamo. Number 3, which of the following is an irregular verb? Choose all answers that apply. A. Essere, to be. B. Avere, to have. C. Fare, to do or make. D. Andare, to go. Or E. Volere, to want. Okay, so in this case, all of them are the correct answer. So all of these are considered irregular verbs because they do not follow the regular conjugation patterns, although some are very close. These are very common and will just need to be memorized. Some other irregular verbs include dare, stare, dovere, potere, and bere. Number 4. Please choose the correct way to say, I want to learn how to cook. As a hint, I'll give you the verbs. So, volere means to want, imparare a, to learn or to learn how, and cucinare means to cook. Choose only one best answer. Okay, so A, volere imparo a cucinare. B, voglio imparo a cucino. C, voglio imparare a cucino. Or D, voglio imparare a cucinare. Okay, so letter D was the correct answer. Whenever you have two or more verbs in a row, you only need to conjugate the first verb. Just like in English, you'd conjugate the first verb and leave the following verb or verbs in their infinitive or to form. For example, I want, conjugated in the first person singular, plus to learn how in the infinitive, plus to cook in the infinitive. Okay, so in Italian, voglio, which is conjugated in the first person singular, plus imparare a in the infinitive, plus cucinare in the infinitive. Note, imparare is usually directly followed by the preposition a when saying to learn how to do something. And number 5, which of the following statements is incorrect? Choose only one best answer. A, we use the impersonal si when we want to express an action, way of thinking, or behaving that is generalized, recommended, or suggested. B, reflexive verbs are verbs whose subject and object are the same. Therefore, the action is reflected back to the person or thing performing the action. They're always accompanied by a reflexive pronoun. Or C, infinitives are the verb forms that have already been conjugated to correspond to the person or thing performing the action. Okay, so letter C was the incorrect answer. So an infinitive, or l'infinito, is the basic form of a verb before it's been conjugated. In English, it's the to form of a verb. In Italian, it's the ere, ere, or ire form. All right, so how did you do? If there are any that you had any trouble with, or if you want to go back and retake the quiz, just feel free to rewatch this video. Otherwise, you can just reread the answers here. And I'll just scroll through these quickly, and you can pause the video if you want to reread any of them. All right, great job.